Glenn, how are you?
Hey, Josh, Cohen, long time no talk to, man.
It's been a long time since I've talked to you or done blogging heads. I've been
very busy.
Hopelessly busy.
Congratulations on the Boston Review, which continues to be a really serious and important magazine, and I know how much work goes into getting it out every time. So
thank you. It's nice of you to say.
Kudos.
Yeah, thanks. Why don't we, since it's been a while since we've been on, why don't we reintroduce ourselves? So you go first.
I'm Glenn Loury, professor of economics at Brown University.
And I'm Josh Cohen, and I'm professor of political science, philosophy, and law at Stanford, and co-editor of Boston Review with my co-editor, Deb Jasmine. And thanks again for the nice comments on the review.
You guys are doing a great job. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, lots happening in the world, but limited time to talk about it, so we'll pick a couple of things. We were going to start by talking about this recent Supreme Court decision about California prisons, basically telling the Supreme Court, upholding a lower court order, telling the state of California that it has to reduce the number of people who are in its prisons, essentially because the overcrowding is preventing the state from providing prisoners with the mental health care and medical care that they need, and they're roughly telling them that the only remedy, and this was the real edge of the decision, that the only remedy for the constitutional violations that come from that the court found, the only remedy for them is to reduce overcrowding. So there are constitutional violations, and that they got to do something about overcrowding because it's the only way to remedy those violations. 5-4 decision, as I think probably everybody knows, with Justice Kennedy, who's generally been on the other side, with the conservatives on the court joining I don't want to quite say the liberals on the court, joining the non-conservatives on the court in this 5-4 decision, with a very strongly worded dissent by Justice Scalia, although whenever Justice Scalia dissents, it's a strongly worded dissent.
You called it the what do you say, the greatest abuse of the judicial power in the history of the Republic?
I think it was a more, I actually have the opinion here.
Okay. We should quote it.
There was some superlative, but it was the most radical injunction. It was an injunction. It was the most radical injunction, a structural injunction issued by the court in our nation's history, an order requiring California to release the staggering number of 46,000 convicted criminals. The order requires California to reduce the number of people in its prisons, and there are a variety of ways that they can do that. They can transfer them to county jails if the state can figure out a way to do that. They can transfer them to jails in other states, or they can release them. The requirement is that they reduce the number of people in the prisons to, at most, I think it's 137% of what the jails are built for. And the thing that I found, disturbing in the Scalia opinion, which was signed by Justice Thomas as well, was there isn't really any point in the opinion where there's an acknowledgement of the severity of the problem, as an acknowledgement that there is some kind of serious constitutional violation, some cruel and unusual. I mean, you lock people up, and as Justice Kennedy says, you lock people up, and maybe you're justified in doing so. Sometimes you're justified in doing so anyway. You lock them up, and then they can't take care of themselves. That's the consequence of locking them up. They can't provide for their own medical care. They can't feed themselves. So you're not allowed to starve prisoners. And, so you got to feed them, and you can't feed them food that's, poisoned or got maggots in it or something like that. You got to feed them. And also, you have to provide them with medical care, including mental health care. And the not just the Supreme Court, but the lower court had found, a persistent violation of those basic requirements. And these cases, well, this was the two cases joined into one. The first case was filed in 1990. So this has been going on for a long time. And there was a lot of frustration on the part of both the lower court and the Supreme Court about the fact that there had been no serious remedy of these issues. Now, in the dissenting opinion by Alito and Roberts, there are a few places where they acknowledge that there's been a serious problem. And what they say is that, well, there's some evidence that things are getting better, and maybe there are some other remedies, like if you're not giving good enough medical care, then what you have to do is make sure that the medical facilities are kept up properly, and maybe you hire some more staff. You don't have to reduce the numbers of people in order to remedy the constitutional violations. But there's at least an acknowledgement of the problem.
I was just going to ask, the determination of the extent to which there would be other interventions that could ameliorate the conditions without releasing the prisoners, isn't that the kind of determination of fact that you would rely upon the lower court's judgment to render, and that's not the kind of thing the court's going to try to pass on with respect to the state of California?
Right. So, to get into that issue about what the Alito and Roberts dissent was complaining about would be kind of legal inside baseball about why the lower court had been unwilling to look at evidence more recent evidence of reductions in the medical problems and the reductions in the numbers of people. The Supreme Court was essentially upholding the findings of fact of the lower court. Now, you were involved in this case.
Well, I was only marginally involved. There's a brief that was put in by 30 criminologists. They use the word liberally. I'm an economist, but I've been writing about crime and punishment off and on over the last few years. There were real criminologists who were part of this group. And some of whom had done careful quantitative analyses of the flows of people coming into the state of incarceration, both within the state of California and across the nation, and how that depended upon arrests for various offenses, sentencing decisions by courts, release decisions by parole boards, decisions of revocation of supervised release status for probationers and parolees, and were able to use the expertise of these criminological investigations to advise the court that it would be feasible to effect this release without an undue endangerment of public safety.
Right.
So that was the opinion that was rendered by us criminologists, which I was a co-signatory to a brief that was signed by 30 social science and criminology experts that went into the deliberation of the court. I actually don't believe that our brief is explicitly cited either in Justice Kennedy's opinion or in the two dissents that you've mentioned. But
so
I have reason to think that the court was aware of our brief. Pardon?
Boiling down I live in California, so boiling down your brief, you're telling me that I don't have to worry any more than I usually do about locking my door.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm telling you, exactly. Or, if the uptick
we unlock our door all the time.
The uptick in your risk will not be discernible. People are going to lock their doors or not lock their doors, but that's what I just want to say for my own part about this case, not having a kind of constitutional law expertise background, but just sort of wondering what the Eighth Amendment might mean in the face of the reality of very high incarceration rates and very limited resources. Right. So the overcrowding, the fact that there are untreated mental health issues that go on for people inside prisons, and all of the things that you just said, raise in my mind the question of, well, if the Constitution doesn't protect incarcerated persons, to the degree that this lower court decision was attempting to assert, then what exactly is excluded by the Eighth Amendment? I mean, you can't chop people's hands off. I mean, what would it be? So I'm not sure I, could credit the rage that I sense is behind Justice Scalia's rejection of the majority's judgment in this case. And I'm also reminded of this previous case in which Justice Thomas this was in a southern state. You may remember the case. This was about the beating of a prisoner by prison guards. And the question was whether or not a federal court or federal court's judgment that the prisoner's rights under the Constitution had been violated would be upheld. And Justice Thomas's view in this case that I only vaguely remember was that, well, of course a prisoner shouldn't be beaten, but that's a matter of state law. Perfectly, his rights are perfectly protected under state law, and it doesn't rise to the level of federal constitutional protection. So he took the view that the Supreme Court ought not to get itself involved there.
The thing about there's the broadly analogous issue, and it comes up in the Scalia-Thomas dissent in this. I think it's fair to say that none of us, anyway, probably not you, not me, like the idea of, to put it in a slogan, federal courts running state prisons. Courts don't have the competence to do that.
Right.
That's fine. So this is the kind of thing you want courts to be dragged into reluctantly. They don't have the competence to do it.
Yeah.
And it's all so. I'm down with that. And the issue that what troubles me, though, and this, as I say, there is something of a difference here between the dissent of the Alito Roberts dissent and the Scalia dissent. Alito and Roberts recognize that there's a problem. I mean, people are dying in these prisons. They say, the death rate has declined. Okay, fine, stipulate that. But they acknowledge that there has been a problem. And you may not like the federal courts jumping in to handle this. I think it's all well and good to be angry at the, California state legislature for not handling the problem. And it's all well and good, frankly, to be angry at people in California for supporting, a punitive approach to, issues about crime, and, throwing lots and lots of people in jail. At one point, the prisons are built to hold 80,000. You got 150,000 people in jail. And it's all well and good to be angry at the people of California for having a kind of immature, childish approach to the issue, saying we're going to throw people in jail and we're not going to respect the Constitution in the way they get treated. That's the principal responsibility of the legislature and of citizens. So you don't like the idea, of the courts being the ones who are handling it. That's fine. But, at a certain point, you acknowledge that there is a problem and there's a constitutional violation and it's going unaddressed, and the people who are supposed to be doing something about it aren't doing something about it, and the courts are acting, in this case, I think it's fair to say, as an agent of last resort. So there's plenty to be unhappy about a situation where the courts, in effect, are arguably doing stuff about telling prisons how to run that you don't like courts doing. You don't want to be in that situation. But I think to blame the court and to be angry at the decision of the court rather than to say this is an unfortunate reality that there's a constitutional violation and the people who should be remedying it are not doing it. So the courts have
aren't they going to say, well, Justices Scalia and Thomas, I imagine, say, first of all, we don't credit your claim that there's a constitutional violation. We differ in that interpretation of the evidence. Yeah. But secondly, that our main responsibility as members of the Supreme Court is to mark out the boundaries of legitimate exercise of the unaccountable power of the judiciary. And while, not to use it as an indirect way of expressing what might be a reasonable degree of displeasure with the policy decisions that people have made. Granted, the state of California should behave differently. Granted, the legislature should behave, and if people want that many in prison, they should be willing to pay for it, consistent with their constitutional obligations. And they're not, and all that's lamentable, but it doesn't follow from this that federal courts and life-appointed unelected judges can legitimately come in over a situation like that and just dictate an outcome.
I think the issue is whether there is a constitutional violation, and if there's a constitutional violation, and that's the day job of people on the court is to do something about it, and to do it consistent with the 1995 Prison Litigation Reform Act, which is how this case was litigated. So I think where the difference, as I see it, very roughly between the Alito dissent and the Scalia dissent, is that Alito and Roberts essentially acknowledge that there has been a constitutional violation, but they don't like the remedy of requirement to court order, requirement to reduce the number of people in prison, because they say things have been getting better, and there are other remedies, and this is this is a remedy of last resort, and we're not at the point of last resort. But they recognize that there have been really unacceptable treatments of people in the past. The position in the Scalia and Thomas dissent is that if an individual's right has been not to be subject to cruel and unusual punishment has been violated, then that individual has a claim for a remedy. But this is a remedy. This is a class action. This is a remedy for the class of prisoners, and there isn't a constitutional violation. There's not cruel and unusual punishment for everybody in the class. There again, I feel like the state is incarcerating people, and it may be justified in incarcerating people. So let's suppose that every one of these people was appropriately incarcerated. Come back to that issue. Nevertheless, as Justice Kennedy says, you have to incarcerate people consistent with the basic principle of human dignity. And when you're locking people up, there are certain kinds of treatment that you can't subject them to. And the claim in this case was that the only way to prevent a persistent violation of the constitutional rights of individual prisoners, the only way to prevent what is going to be the violation of those rights is to reduce the level of overcrowding. I mean, that's what the lower court had to judge, was that you cannot, under the Prison Litigation Reform Act of 95, they had to make a show, and they had to come to the conclusion that the only way to remedy this persistent violation was to reduce the number of people in jail. And,
Now, this is an interesting point, if I can just interrupt. The U.S. Congress, in that Prison Litigation Reform Act, were acting so as to make it more difficult for litigants on behalf of incarcerated persons to get into federal court and bring lawsuits enjoining state authorities from doing this or doing that. Am I not correct? You're starting to move from a little above my pay grade to way above my pay grade. That's right. So this is my impression from other things that I've seen in which the Prison Litigation Reform Act has been mentioned by progressive critics of the criminal justice system.
Absolutely.
As
1995, this was not a high point of progressive legislation.
Exactly. So this is the Congress trying to make states' attorney generals and state prison authorities relatively immune from litigation, and yet this then is the framework under which this litigation now is being proceeded. In other words, they've had to overcome obstacles or procedural barriers.
That's right. You got to have a three-judge panel doing it.
You
can't be just one judge. You got to have a three-judge panel doing it. You have to really give serious consideration, and this is what you criminologists weighed in on. You have to give really serious consideration to the public safety, public security issues that come from release. You're not supposed to impose a particular remedy. I mean, they say you got to reduce the number of people inside, but there are lots of ways to reduce the number of people inside without putting them out on the street, and those that leave open those possibilities. And you have to make the determination that reducing overcrowding is the only reasonable way to prevent the persistent violation of the constitutional rights. So yes, this was, there's an increase in the hurdle. The district court judge, does the fact find they judge that this burden is met, and the Supreme Court then upholds this. And as I say, having courts telling schools how to run, how to be run, or prisons how to be run, institutions, this is not what you want courts to be doing. But when you got people who are getting locked, people with mental illness who are being locked up in little cages. This is what I find awful about about the Scalia opinion. I mean, you can get as angry as you want at the court, at the the legislature, but you have just seems like an absolutely unacceptable circumstance, which is why you have the very unusual situation of photographs being included in the majority opinion in this case.
Yeah, I saw that. I just want. I think we should probably go into the second topic, but I just want to say one further. At a kind of broadly gauged sort of political, moral level. Okay, so we have this institutional phenomenon, which has been the really amazing growth of incarceration as an aspect, one aspect of our social policy, of our management of a lot of difficult problems that we have in society. And the scale of it, and the reach of it, and the impact of it, particularly in certain vulnerable and marginal communities, and all that goes behind it. You mentioned the state assembly in California and the voters and the kind of politics of it and the way in which people run for office. And, it insinuates itself into our kind of national character. It becomes a part of who, the United States of America have become here in the stage of late capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. It mars us on a global stage to some degree, And so there's going to be a politics behind that goes everything from Willie Horton ads to judicial elections at the county level, and then there's a kind of morality around that, and how we manage the difficult shores of this kind of thing that we're navigating here, and how we assert our values, in the American political culture, and restrain and limit and parse. It's really extremely important, and the court's decision, I think, can be seen, this particular decision, partly in that light of our fitful, difficult effort to negotiate what's really a fraught circumstance. I mean, morally fraught. I mean, crime and punishment, these are not just clean black and white things. You say, let's suppose that everyone who's in jail is legitimately incarcerated. Okay, fair enough. But that hardly ends the discussion.
Absolutely.
How we punish them, what we do with them, how we stigmatize them. I mean, how we nevertheless maintain sight of their humanity, even as we're.
So here,
really fundamental things.
I agree with you, and one thing is, Justice Kennedy says, sometimes you got to lock people up, but when you lock people up, you have to treat them with basic human dignity. And that means you have to, since you're responsible for feeding them, taking care of their health, you got to do that consistent with respecting their human dignity. Now, neither you nor me would be it's not our first best to lock up more than 2 million people and treat them with human dignity while they're locked up. That's not our first best. I mean, better that they're treated with human dignity while they're locked up than that they're not treated with human dignity. But, it's not our first best to have so many people incarcerated, but treated properly while they're incarcerated. And what I think we could, hope for it's probably unrealistic, but I think what we could hope for is that this is a challenge. There's a public conversation, and the court has now made a move in this public conversation about incarceration. And what they've said is, you want to lock up more than 2 million people, you have to do it consistent with respecting their dignity, and that's costly to do. It's more costly than doing it and disrespecting their dignity. That's more costly. Okay, so now you decide. Do you really want to lock up more than 2 million people when you really pay the costs of doing that? And this goes back to a conversation we've had a few times earlier about this imprisonment issue. There was you go back to Bentham's introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, and Bentham says, criminal punishment is a cost. It is, he says, in itself evil. Evil meaning it imposes pain. So you've got to make sure that you got a good enough reason for doing it. And I think what the court could be in the kind of public discourse about this issue, what we can hope for is that this decision by the court is going to say, do you really want to do this? By saying, are you prepared to pay the costs that you have to pay in order to pursue this policy? And I'm just connecting a few dots here. You got the California, maybe they shouldn't be connected, but you got the California decision. You got a new prison commissioner in the state of Maine who's basically said you can't run supermax jails in Maine the way they've been run. We're going to reduce the number of people who've basically been subjected to a kind of legalized torture in Maine. And then you have this report that's come out recently that says, privatizing prisons is not a great cost saver. I think a couple of things are happening that may produce a different kind of public conversation.
There was the Supreme Court's recent decision about life without the possibility of parole for juvenile offenders.
There's something wrong with this picture when you have the way highest rates of incarceration in the world. And I think what we can hope for is that this decision by the court provokes a more serious public conversation about that, about the incarceration problem. Anyway,
just one more thing on this. You talk about the cost. Okay, you want to hold in California 150, in Texas 170,000 people in a year, at a given time in prison. But doing it in a way that's consistent with remaining mindful of their human dignity is going to be costly. So you make the decision, but we're going to hold you to the thing. But the observation I want to make there is, yes, costly, but in the status quo ante, before there's any intervention by the court, the people who are bearing some of those costs are the prisoners. So just as a political matter, this is a kind of property right argument that I'm about to make here. Who's entitled to what? And so where do the costs actually fall? So if I can make the cost fall on the prisoner and get away with it, well, that's a politically easy thing to do. I can tell the voter out there, look, I'm going to respond to your concerns about public safety and your desire for retribution and revenge by coming down very hard on these people. When I do so, it's going to engender large costs. But guess what? They're going to bear those costs. And unless there's a policeman somewhere holding me accountable for imposing those costs on them, I'll be able to get away with imposing those costs on them. So this is just another argument about why the intervention of the court on behalf of the rights enshrined in the Constitution of citizens is entirely appropriate.
I agree with you about that. Let's let's shift to this other subject quickly. Friend Cornel West.
Cornel West. We laugh, but it's not funny. Cornel West has been on a tear of late, criticizing the President of the United States in very memorable terms. He has referred to the President as a black mascot of Wall Street oligarchs
corporate plutocrats.
That's a quote. I believe that this is an accurate quote of brother Cornel West, and he said this on cable television.
He said it with Ed Schultz before Ed Schultz got bounced for his disgusting, stupid, repulsive remark about
Oh, calling someone a slut?
Yeah, Laura Ingram. Yeah.
Oh, yes, Laura Ingram, I forgot her name, yeah. Yeah, he got bounced for that?
He's, yeah.
I hadn't heard that he was bounced for that.
Suspended.
This is the guy who comes on MSNBC commercials to say, I need 2 shows, as he, laments what's wrong with America and so forth.
No, if he had 2 shows, he might have the audience that other people have for 1. But, this is just, the thing is, it's one of these things where you want to say, that Edge shows, it's not just that he should keep some stuff inside, not everything that not everything that occurs in his head is worth coming out of his mouth. But that kind of shit shouldn't be occurring to him at all. I mean, there's just something wrong with that. Anyway, he's gotten beaten up. I hope he continues to get beaten up for it. It was a disgusting remark.
But
but back to Cornel. So Cornel was on with him, and he said he was following up on an interview that he had done, and in which he had said something about the president keeping his distance from free black men, that he's kind of has more, he likes upper white class, white brothers and Jewish brothers.
Jewish brothers. He actually went there, Josh.
Well, so keeping his distance, which is very important, it's keeping his distance from free black men who tell him the truth. Now, I guess Charles Ogletree doesn't count as telling him the truth, because but here's something. I mean, Cornel has been a very pretty consistent critic of the Obama administration from the beginning. He did a lot of events for Obama during the campaign. I think the number that I've seen is 45 events.
Oh, yeah, scores of appearances that he made on behalf of the president during the...
And he's been pretty upset since he didn't get the kind of invitation that he wanted to the... and that he thought he was entitled to the inauguration. And he was not happy about, like a lot of people. Anyway, he's been a pretty consistent critic, although the level of the criticism and the tone of the criticism and this kind of personalization of the criticism. And Cornell's acknowledged that there's a kind of personally aggrieved character to some of this recent criticism. That's it has certainly intensified. And there's one aspect of this that I find. We can talk about the substance of the criticism, but this personally aggrieved stuff. I mean, you take somebody like Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald has been a very consistent and very strong critic of the Obama administration, pretty much all along. Or Noam Chomsky, very strong, very consistent critic all along. And Greenwald and Chomsky and other, they don't expect to get an invitation to a state dinner. They know that if they're going to make those criticisms, consistent, strong, principled criticisms, not giving any ground, that they are going to be outsiders, and they don't expect anything different from that. They're not looking to be whispering. They're not looking to be prophets of the palace. And the thing that troubles me.
This is very good. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go on, Josh. I think you got it right on the. It's the conflation of two different things. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
There is an argument about policy and about politics and about ideas and ideology and sort of definition of purpose and all of that. And then there's this issue of being wired, of being connected, of being an insider. And I do believe that one of the problems, and I should have allowed you to finish before I give. We can talk about the substance too, but I do believe that Cornel, whatever the merit of the substance, diminishes the effectiveness of being a critic by conflating these, he likes to call people brother. My Jewish brother is this, my Catholic brother is this, my brother. And the idea that there is a personal dimension to the thing, and that he, there's a kind of fealty there. We got a black president. I'm a black public intellectual. I don't mean to put words in Cornel West mouth, but there does seem to be something about, I expected more from you. I expected, almost a kind of personal disappointment at the thing, and that's not consistent with a prophetic intellectual and political profile. Speaking truth to power doesn't get you invited to the state dinner, which is what you just said, and I agree with that.
And that's I can't have, I don't know, Cornel, I know Cornel, I think he's a wonderful person, plays a significant public role. I don't want to claim some inside knowledge about why he's so upset now. But the way it comes across, somebody who likes and admires him, is that he wants to play that prophetic role, make those sharp criticisms, principled criticisms, speak for the powerless, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he also thinks he should then, at the same time, have some kind of insider role. That when he calls Obama, Obama should call him back, instead of, complaining that he calls Obama and Obama doesn't call him back. Well, you make those kind of criticisms and you don't get invited. Now, that's not a reason for backing off on the criticisms, but that's the consequence.
Exactly. And the only reason we know about him not getting the invitation to the inaugural that he might have thought, or getting that return phone call, is because he has told us.
That's right.
And I think this is an inartful way of conducting yourself if your main purpose is to engage in a kind of political criticism. I mean, even if it's untrue completely, that your motives are something less than pure, you invite anybody who doesn't want to hear your critical remark to attribute what you just said to impure personal motives of jealousy or pique.
And I think the reason
so I don't think Cornel's handled it very well.
I think the reason I added that detail to the remark about keeping his distance from free black men, and it's not just distance from free black men, it's free black men who tell him the truth. This isn't just to get the quotation right, but I think it's important because let's say Cornel, when Cornel says people who tell him the truth, he means people who are saying the kind of things that Cornel is saying. That's fine, okay? It's not like there are a lot of people who are saying those things to Obama who are white rather than black. It's not like there are a lot of Jewish brothers. This is not what Rahm Emanuel was telling Obama when Rahm Emanuel was around the White House.
Oh, as if Obama could hear it from the Jewish brother, but can't hear it from
That's
the
right.
black brother.
He's not hearing it from anyone. Maybe Jared Bernstein, before he left Biden's economic advisor, Jared Bernstein was saying something in this neighborhood. But, basically, Obama has, surrounded himself with advisors who are not conveyors of Cornel's message, and it doesn't matter whether they're, white, black, or brown, or men or women.
Hold on just a minute, Josh. Hold on. I'm on the phone, and I'll be out in about 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I think that it's he's not keeping his distance from free black men. He's got, as I say, Charles Ogletree talks to him, among others, and if it's people who are telling him the truth about the circumstances of, people who are in, go back to the earlier issue about people who are in prison, or about black and white working Americans who are suffering a lot, or, people in Afghanistan who are on the other side of the war, or for that matter, people in Libya who are on the other. It's not like it's not like Cornel's views on that are getting through from other messengers. So I think on that point, I think bringing in the race issue was I think inappropriate. But I don't know. Do you agree about that? Is there a race?
No, I don't think I do with this last. I'm not unsympathetic to the main point that you're making, which is that the coterie of advisors that President Obama has is what it is. And it's a centrist establishment, relative to progressives, conservative or accommodating coterie. And that hasn't got anything to do with the color of anybody. It has to do with the fact that the guy is running a particular kind of campaign, and he's trying to get himself reelected, and he's conducting his, it's not like he's doing anything radically different from what he sort of signaled or told us that he would do. But the extent of my disagreement, I think, can be summed up in the observation that quite apart from anything that President Obama may want or have said, the symbolic significance of him being an African American and being elevated to the highest office has deep historical resonance. I mean, it's up there with King. It's up there with the big turns of the wheel that have occurred over the course of the country's development of its democracy, from a state when the Africans were chattel to a state recently arrived at within our own lifetimes that we have become equal citizens. And the drama of that, the kind of pathos of that, the kind of moral weight of that history is to some degree necessarily, whether the president wants it or not, embodied in his elevation to and conduct of the office of the presidency. Now, it's about more than black people, to be sure. It's about a lot more than black people. But it is about black people. Therefore, it is also about black people. Therefore, when I hear, for example, when I'm going to say this, I hear the Reverend Jeremiah Wright's vituperations. Let me just stipulate for the record that I don't agree with a lot of it. Okay? But I hear it, and it resonates to me, and I've said this on Blocking Heads before. Growing up on the south side of Chicago in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, I kind of know where he's coming from. Now, he's wrong about a lot of stuff, and he's extreme about some stuff, but there's nothing inauthentic or illegitimate about the wellspring of critical reaction to the American self-defining national narrative that animates a person like Jeremiah Wright. Okay? There's nothing, it needs to be put into the mix. It needs to be considered along with my Catholic brothers from Ireland, excitement about the struggles of their people there, my Jewish brothers from wherever they may be from, concerns about the developments over there, that this is a part of the American political sensibility, and it has some moral authority with it, and it's tied up with the president because his blackness is tied up with it. Now, having said all of that, there are dilemmas, and there are blind alleys, and there are many pitfalls, but having a clearly articulated criticism from the progressive and sort of critical end of the American spectrum that has a kind of black resonance to it that says, as President Obama, the bargainer, has managed all of these conflicts and we may wish him success, and he's a very good man, and so forth and so on, understand something. The critical edge of African American, sort of political, witness, holding America to a higher standard, pointing out its hypocrisies and inconsistencies, making sure that we don't become triumphalist and have amnesia about all of the, difficult things that, that we've had to overcome and the growth that we've had to experience. And saying that, notwithstanding the fact that the president has to make his compromise, notwithstanding, let me just be concrete, the fact that he has to preside over a war on terror and American military hegemony at a global scale, the fact that he has to legitimate huge transfers of wealth and the maintenance of huge disparities of wealth, which are at the very root of the political economy of this nation, which don't necessarily have to be legitimate in some abstract sense. I mean, the bankers, the thing that happened in 2007, 2008, 2009 in terms of how we managed the financial crisis and what the effective redistribution upward of wealth power, the fact that people making $1 million or $10 million or $100 million a year can buy our government, and when an African American ascends to the highest office, he's the one who's selling it. All of these things need to be said by a Noam Chomsky, and they need to be said by a black Noam Chomsky, is the kind of thing that I'm saying. But they need to be said in a way that doesn't sully that message, the sort of purity of that prophetic and critical message, with all of this kind of personal baggage and things like this.
It's eloquently said, and there were lots of things said there. I think I agree. If I don't agree with all of them, I agree with most of them. I can't remember the ones I disagreed with, if I did disagree with any of them. But, I think the issue there is there's an important point that Cornel also made that I think got buried in the personalization of it and the personal expressions of disappointment and not being able to be the prophet at the palace, which is that has said that maybe the time has come for he's talked about civil disobedience and whether that's the right strategy or not. I think one of the things that's happened is that Obama, we've talked about this before, Obama basically ran, more or less, whatever the poetry about hope and change, he ran on the policy substance more or less as a centrist. He was getting beaten up by Clinton and Edwards on health care during the campaign because he didn't have a progressive enough position on health care. He was very clear all along that though he didn't like the war in Iraq, he really liked, I'm just putting it crudely, but he really liked the war in Afghanistan. Right. That was the good war. He, got beaten up some because he was basically on, a too strong a free trade guy. So it was pretty clear that he was running as a, centrist Democrat. And, the fact of the matter is that his voting record was pretty consistent with that. Nevertheless, he became, during the campaign and subsequent to the campaign, the focus of the projection of all kinds of fantasies that people had about him as both negative fantasies, palling around with terrorists, but also, positive fantasies that he was really much more, deeply, committedly, progressive.
Indeed. He really agrees with us, but he can't say so. But once he gets in there, we'll see.
Right. And I think then what you had was, you've had lots of, this disappointment in what he's done. And my feeling about this is like, don't whine, organize. The best thing that's happened in the country over the past couple of months, I think, is what happened in Wisconsin. And who knows that maybe when the history of, the political history of this period is written, that may turn out to have been a very important set of events. Because the fact is that whatever Obama stands for, there can't be a progressive president if there's not a progressive political movement. You got a mobilized right. Yep. You got a Democratic Party and a president who got slaughtered in 2010, and they got slaughtered in 2010 not just because the economy was doing badly, but because of the health care bill. And it becomes tepid, compromised, give away to the drug companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We all know the litany there, but the fact is they not only lost because of the economy, the evidence is that they lost because of the health care bill. You've got, this guy in office, and you invite this arrogant son of a bitch. Congress invites this arrogant son of a bitch Netanyahu to give it, and they're standing on their feet cheering for him while he's insulting the president and distorting what the president said. Okay.
Thank you.
Absolutely outrageous. And as outrageous as Netanyahu's behavior was, in my view, the behavior of Congress was even more outrageous because they applauded it.
Including the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, who made a point of coming out front and dissing the president.
Right, so you got a guy. So here's a guy who's got a tough job, and not to mention the fact that you're going through a period of economic calamity and both national and state municipal level budgetary crisis. You got a guy who's got a very tough job, and there is unions in a continuing state of disrepair and decline. There's no peace movement. So no peace movement. There have been there's been some movement on immigration, but you don't have anything going on outside normal politics that's putting pressure on
Meanwhile,
him.
the Tea Party.
And then you get up and you say, hey, you're not doing the right thing. You're not being Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was getting pushed pretty hard from the left also. So I think this projection of a kind of image of Obama as the progressive that he wasn't onto him, and the expectation that he's going to deliver on the promises of a non-existent progressive movement. I think it's politically silly. And so to come back to Cornel, when Cornel says, maybe the time has come to stop projecting progressive fantasies onto Obama, or expecting him to be something other than what he is, or expecting him to do any different from what he is when he's not subject to any kind of political pressure from the progressive, from the left, as well as subjected to pressure from the right, who don't believe lots of people don't even believe he is the constitutionally legitimate president of the United States because he wasn't born in the country, and other pieces of total lunacy. You got so when Cornel says civil disobedience, I'm just taking that as a marker for people should be reducing their expectations of the president and of the Democratic Party and increasing their expectations of themselves and the need to be an organized, mobilized, and powerful force. And I think that was a hidden message in what Cornel said, but that one I agree with.
Well, I think I can sign off on 100% of what I just heard you say in that last soliloquy, and we both got to go. So.
Wonderful to talk.
So good to talk to you again, Josh. Yeah, take care of yourself. Bye-bye.